There, now it's recording. So the world, we don't know that the world exists except for our own machinery, our own subjective machinery, right? That's how we know. And when we were born, we have no language. So really, we have no world, right? Other than just that perception of our mother's breast or something, you know? There's nothing really going on. If you look around, if an infant looks around, there's nothing to look at other than what his senses takes in, right? Because there's no machinery, no developed machinery to make the world a world. So really, the subjectivity, our thinking, is what makes the world. Because what else would define the world, right? Would it be because somebody tells us that the world is such, some scientist tells us the world is the way it is, or some explorer tells us the way it is? You have to take, your mind is what decides whether that scientist knows, or whether the explorer is telling you something significant. So really, it's a subjective thing. Objectivity is a subjective thing, and that's really the foundation of why we should be free. And so, when we look at the sciences, the ones that we're used to, they're very technical, they're very specific. They don't describe life, they only describe their technical areas, you know. And so we have all this technology that comes out of these sciences. We have the physiology, which is very intricate. The knowledge of the physiology is very intricate. But these are very technical things, and it's called a posteriori science. It's experimental science, right? You have theory and then experimentation. And it goes from physics to, you know, the more abstract sciences, the more systematic and mathematical sciences, down to the more concrete, the more, like physiology, you know. You can get your handle on that a lot more, right? Or psychology. And they all have experimentation, but they don't have that much theory that's coherent. It's not systematic like physics is. It's nowhere near that way. And then there are the sciences that are a priori, like math and logic. And the question is economics any different? Because the standard view is economics, the view that the logical positivists want us to have, or wanted us to have when they started logical positivism, was that economics is an a posteriori science. That's the way that logical positivism is about. It's about denying subjectivity. There's no subjective basis for knowledge. There's no inner knowledge. And there's no knowledge about the world that comes without experimentation. That's the premise of logical positivism. And these scientists, of course, are not logical positivist scientists. But if economics were an a priori science, like math or physics, math or logic, then the story is totally different. It's a subjective thing. It comes out of your consciousness. That's how you do logic and math, right? You don't do it by experimentation. You do it out of your consciousness. And then you try to apply it to the world. So they rejected Euclidean geometry, and non-Euclidean geometry is what the model for the world is now. So it becomes testable at that point. But generally speaking, it's not testable, and generally speaking, logic, you know, the law of the excluded middle doesn't require, you can't refute it or confirm it by experimentation. Whereas economics, the economics profession adopted logical positivism in the 1950s. Milton Friedman insisted that economics was not the way it had already been for hundreds of years. Everybody did it out of their head. Even though they observed the world, they learned about finance and things, like Adam Smith, for instance, or Carl Menger, who came up with the law of the marginal revolution, the law of marginal utility. He was a financial writer. But how did he understand that the additional item of a homogeneous good is valued less? That's a logical proposition. That's an a priori proposition. And so these kinds of, so this is the debate. And that debate, hovering around that debate, whether knowledge is internal or external, whether it can be got without experimentation, whether it needs to be, you know, whether economics has to be like physics. And they've done that. Even 100 years ago they wanted to do that. There was a split. When Carl Menger discovered the law of marginal utility, there was a split where his method was internal. It was subjective. Subjective valuation is the basis of whether or not you would pay, how much you would pay for the additional chair. You know, you want 6 chairs, you want 1,000 chairs, you want another 1,000 chairs, you're going to pay less for the extra 1,000 chairs. That's the law of marginal utility. And that explains why prices are what they are. And so there's this, so logical positivism took over economics, and they made it into a mathematical science and an experimental science at Milton Friedman's insistence. And then, so that's the epistemological key or balance point right there for my talk, which includes other a priori propositions like the one I introduced in the beginning about what subjectivity is and what objectivity is. So it's independent of experimentation. We know things, and that's what Ludwig von Mises, who was a follower of Carl Menger, that was his point, that economics is not a experimental science. It's an a priori science. It's like mathematics and physics and logic. Excuse me. So, and then he also described a science which is not really a science, called it thymology, which is how you do history or how you do any kind of judgment of a situation before you make a commitment to it in business or in personal relationships. And he said history is not like science. It's not theoretical followed by experimentation. That's not what history is. We're not doing experiments when we do history. We're going in and we're analyzing why you know, so-and-so passed a particular bill. What were his incentives for that? Who was he trying to please? Or was it purely for altruistic reasons? Those kinds of things are what we do when we do business. Is that Vera? Hi, Vera. Okay, so...
You know John Price? You heard of John Price?
Mathematician?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, he was the one who proved there's no such thing as altruism, and then he committed suicide trying to disprove his own theory.
Well,
Here's a point.
if you commit suicide, and that's
just throwing a point out that
yeah.
You know, when you talk about altruism, I mean, mathematically he proved that there's no such thing as altruism.
Oh well, that may be the case.
But then it drove him nuts because he didn't believe it. He didn't believe it's on math.
But you see, if a hero sacrifices himself, and this is maybe a similar logic to what you're talking about, he's not doing it out of pure altruism. He's doing it out of self-interest.
Well, his problem was his definition itself. Because he had it into the small self, whereas instead of the large self.
Yeah, and that brings me to Maharishi Vedic science, which is not what I want to talk about in this talk, because what I want to do is remind everybody that Maharishi Vedic science is about integration of relative knowledge with pure knowledge. It's not about something that is dismissive of relative knowledge. And so, you know, like the principle that the government is an innocent mirror of the collective consciousness. All you have to do is raise the collective consciousness, and then you can improve the government. My point is that government has inherent problems. And so let's get to that point.
But, you know, the last, you know, if you go to the 10th monolith, the last verse of the 10th monolith describes what a government will be in the age of enlightenment, in Sayuga.
Uh-huh.
And that basically it goes through, it evolves through democracy into a communist state. That's the ultimate.
Uh-huh. Well, that seems
That's
to me...
that's according to, you know, it's different Vedic scholars.
Yeah, but you see, I've never heard Maharshi say that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know, Maharshi didn't get into politics.
Well,
Other than his point of view.
He denounced democracy. He said, damn democracy. For some reason, it's a definite article. He said, damn the democracy. Why he did that? But we know that government, if not a priori, by definition, we know it's a monopoly, right? It doesn't make sense to think of government as a competitive institution, right? Where anybody can set up shop. You know?
Well, that's
Kelly's government, pay less taxes here.
It's a manipulative monopoly. It's not just a monopoly, it's a manipulated monopoly.
Well,
that's what disturbs me.
If you're a monopoly, can you exist without violence?
Well,
wait,
regardless of that part.
Go back to the monopoly part. I mean, they're selling a product. What's the product that they're monopolizing?
Well, they're selling protection, and they're selling prosperity in some cases, which is pretty absurd.
Control is another one.
Well, they're not selling control.
No, they don't have to. They're using it.
They're selling a peaceful society, right?
Well, in some
Safety.
cases.
They're selling safety.
In some cases.
Yeah, yeah. And
So their competition is religion?
yeah, they have a lot of competition. What did Ron Paul have on his desk when he was in Congress? He had a plaque.
I don't listen to Ron Paul.
He had a plaque that said, "Don't steal. The government hates competition."
Well, sir.
See, but I don't mean to just talk about the corruption of government or the fact that power took over government. I'm trying to say that there's something inherent in government. So let me get to that now. That has problems. So assuming that government's a monopoly, can you have a monopoly without violence?
But you know, when you start off with an assumption that's wrong in the first place, where are you going to wind up? Can you wind up at a good place if you start off with a wrong assumption? I'm sorry. I gotta go. That's it for me.
Oh, well, that's okay.
I liked your input. Come on, stay.
Thanks for coming.
I'm out here.
Yeah. So can you have a government without violence? Can you have a monopoly without violence? Is what I meant to say. It seems absurd because let's say you're providing a particular service and you're the only one in town, and somebody else thinks to themselves, "Well, I can do this better and cheaper." And if you're a monopoly, if somebody can do that, then you're not a monopoly. The only reason they can't do it is because of violence, right? They threaten everybody, and that's what governments do. I mean, no one. First of all, if I put up a sign that said Kelly's government, nobody would say, nobody would believe in it. Or if they started believing in it, then the government would shut it down with violence. That's just the way the world works. That's the meaning of government, and that's given. That power is given to a certain group of people by the majority of people. That's how they got it. And
How do we take it back?
yeah. So, is society and ecology too complex to manage? Well, that's a separate question, isn't it? Obviously, society is very complex, but it's not just complex because of logistics, of moving stuff around. It has to be done. Somehow, some mechanism does that, right? Because we have societies with very little government and stuff moves around. And the more the government is, the less stuff moves around, and the more problems there are. The less people are fed and clothed and housed and made happy. And the reason they're, the underlying that difficulty of logistics is the fact that everybody wants to be in charge of themselves. So that in other words, everyone has a world within inside themselves. And that's what actually defines the objective world. So that takes the complexity of the ecology to a whole higher level, right? An infinitely greater level of complexity. So even if, there was a book by Ludwig von Mises in 1920 called Socialism that said it's impossible to calculate how to, for the proletariat to calculate how to manage a society, how to shift stuff around. It's so complicated. It all feeds back on itself in an unknown way. Nobody knows how it works. And I mean, you know in principle how it works, but you can't describe how particular things go.
If you talk to Tammy Pepperman on the internet, she says there's 5 CAFRs, 5 aspects of government, and the money is just circulating around through those. So she's figured it out.
Oh yeah, in principle you can figure out complex systems, but you can't map them, and you can't tell what they should be, especially when they're alive.
Yeah.
They're organic, and they're doing their own thing,
Yeah.
which is the whole point about every point in that economy is subjective. It's a subjective being, and it's creating the objective reality. So, where were we? Yeah. So that's the 2 reasons that ecology, that society is too complex to handle. It has to manage itself, just like a forest manages itself. Nobody directs it, or forces anything. So then we get to this whole idea about law. There's so much confusion about law and about private property. And so I just laid out all these relationships which are self-evident, a priori, unrefutable. Law is prior to government. Everybody knows, your mother tells you what is right and wrong. That's law. And everybody's already very aware of law. And then the government comes in and makes it, they put a layer on it, they formalize it. And yet, because we're dealing with monopoly, that can lead to problems. It's very important to have competition. So, does law presuppose freedom? Well, what else is it for? It's to protect us. It's to protect us so we can live. That's what it's for. It's not to protect the government or somebody else or something else. Does freedom presuppose private property? Well, look, if in the Pilgrims' days, the myth was that they didn't know how to feed themselves, and that the Indians came along and showed them how. But that's not what was going on. They were there for 2 years, and they were communists. They set themselves up as communists. Now, if you're a communist, if you're working for communist people, what's your incentive to work hard? If you don't get what you make, if you have to give away your labor to other people, you don't have much incentive to do anything, do you? And that's what happens in a communist society. Everybody does as little as possible. So what they did was they let people have private property. I mean, instantly they were cured of their starvation because they started producing for themselves. So that was a big myth. And so private property rights have to always be there. Socialism will never work because our natures are individual and localized and personal and internal and karmic. Nobody can be defining you what you're gonna have.
So have you taken your property off the tax roll?
I don't think that would work. And so if you have private property and somebody else wants it and you have a lawful society, how do they get the property from you? They have to bid for it, don't they? If you want, your property is your body, and they want you to work, they have to bid for it. If you own something, that they want to buy, they have to bid for it. If they want your money, and they have to produce something you want, so they have to compete. Now, is competition? What that means, obviously, is you have to be altruistic. If you have to compete for somebody else's stuff, you have to know what they want. You have to consider other people. What do they say in business? Customer is always right. So competition is altruism. Now, the last one is altruism. Does that presuppose self-interest? And this is what we were talking about earlier before David left. And it does the hero, when he saves people and he sacrifices himself, who's he doing that for? He's doing it for them, but he's primarily doing it for himself. Because he wants to be a hero. He wants to feel good about himself. He wants to define himself. Or she. Or the same with a mother. When she loves a baby, she's loving herself. She's not loving something without any reference to herself. It's always in all reference to herself.
It's all self.
Yeah. It's always for her. And so all altruism is self-interest. And then finally, if it's self-interest, to create law, because you want to live safely, and you want to live with happy people around you. And of course, there's some people who are destructive, but the majority of people want law to be around them. They want people to be secure in their property.
Yeah.
You know?
When they're-
So the people are individuals who make law. They get together and they decide on things. And in Somalia, there's no government. Now, when you read about Somalia, you hear about the provisional government, and you hear about some governments in the north. But they're not governments. They're just kind of tribal dominations. But see, the people who write, the intellectuals, the people who went to college or whatever, the intelligentsia of the world, the media, they can't stand the idea of not being a power structure to worship. They can't stand that. So they can't even think of the country as an anarchy. They very seldom refer to it as an anarchy. But in Somalia, they have tribal law. Not only is it tribal, but it's competitive. And if you have a property dispute with somebody, you go to the tribal leader. And then he goes to, and then you make your accusation to the defendant about the defendant. And then the tribal leader makes a decision, and then there's tribal custom that if he steals one goat, you get back two. Things like that. And that's the way ancient England was. That's the way Anglo-Saxon England was before the Normans invaded. In other words, they made the person whole. And I hesitate to use the word restitution because it's a French word. And the French word is associated with the invasion of the Normans. And the Normans destroyed restitution. Oh no, the crime was against the king. So the king gets the money and the criminal goes to jail, which is useless. It's useless. You want the victim to be made whole again. And that's the difference with a law which is spontaneous within the individual, and a law which is just power, and it creates a religion around it. That's what, people whose belief in power it's a religious thing. Oh, we have to have somebody in charge, And these tribal leaders in Somalia people have to be happy with the way they handle the law, the customary law. Otherwise, they'll pick somebody else. You got to be on your toes in a free society. You got to find out what you're good at too. And that's the advantage of freedom. You find out what you're good at. So let me get back to the logic here. So then we go to the real core part, which I've already introduced in the introduction, is does authority depend on objective knowledge? Well, that's true by definition, right? You don't say, well, he's got authority, but he doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. You don't say that, do you? If you have authority, that means you must have some knowledge. And it's objective knowledge, right? Because, I live in my own universe, my subjective universe, but when I'm talking to you, we have to decide whether the chair is blue or red. There's some language involved. And that's what we learn language for in order to create the world. We create the world through our consciousness and through language. So, and this objective knowledge comes from subjectivity. Where else does it come from? Does it just exist out there? And then we have to, it's not just that we use our eyeballs, it's that we ascribe things, which means we use language. And so therefore we create the objective world from ourselves. Each and every one of us lives in a common world of using language. So we know what's red and what's blue. But we don't live in a common subjective world. And so each of us creates that objective world. And that's why subjectivity is completely private. So therefore, if we live in a subjective world, if subjectivity is completely private, and objectivity is made by subjectivity, what does anybody have to say about us? What authority do they have over me? I created the knowledge. Somebody knows about physics, advanced technical physics, and he knows about the way the world works and all that. But it's up to me to decide whether he is an authority in physics. It's up to me to decide how to use that authority, that person. Or if you could hire a painter, it's up to me to decide whether he's a good painter or not. It's my world. And so I answered yes to all these questions. And therefore, I have a basis for understanding all political questions. So I go over here, and I answered these three questions. So then I go to applications, and I want to know about education. Because what am I doing now? I'm educating. I'm de-educating, re-educating, And government wants education for obvious reasons. They want us to, first of all, they want us to think that we need them. They don't want us to think about subjectivity.
Education is the government's thing, where knowledge is the spiritual aspect. And they don't want us to know that we're spiritual and unamenable.
Yeah. I don't mind the terminology so much, but it's a the thing about education also is that if it's done by monopoly, government, there's no competition. And the thing about government is not that there aren't good people in government. There are, especially when it starts. Especially when education started 100 years ago, it became government education. then the people who went in were idealistic, one, and two, they came from a tradition of service. Remember I talked about competition here? Service and competition is the same thing. Altruism. They came from that tradition. In other words, after the war, all blacks were illiterate. All ex-slaves were illiterate. Northern blacks, a lot of red, maybe 2 out of 6 million blacks in the South read, but they were all illiterate. There was no public schools, and the whites wouldn't let them go in if there were. I mean, it wasn't so bad the first 10 years because of the occupation of the South. But in 40 years, 50% of blacks could read. By 1905, they taught themselves to read. Somehow they got it done. There's no government education. It's a miracle. But that's what we do when we're free. I mean, we can be miraculous when we're in chains as well. But it's easier. But most of us aren't that powerful. I mean, you can still be miraculous if you have a good attitude inside. But you don't want to do it like that, right? You want to do it the easy way.
Have you heard of syntax?
Because nature will make us become great anyway, over time.
Have you heard of syntax grammar?
No.
Okay, Google David Wynn Miller. He's teaching syntax grammar, and that's perfection of government with common law. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you can get around all these preconditions of government. And government also wants logical positivism, because it goes hand in hand with thinking that there's no subjectivity. That's what logical positivism is all about. Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, and those guys. I used to read those guys 40 years ago. And so that's what they're all about. They're all about, oh no, there's this authority out here. Here's this reality. So therefore, you have to obey, because we know what the reality is. We have authorities. We're all ranked in our government positions. We went to college and so on. The other reason is there are special interests of researchers in economics, especially, but other fields as well. And in economics, in real economics, you don't need research assistants to go out and crunch numbers for you. All you got to do is think it through logically, and you can get the whole field of the whole branch of economics. Whereas, if you have a lot of research to do, you got people getting paid to do that. So they want, it's part of the partnership of particular industries and government. It's a partnership. In other words, it's a partnership to waste money, but somebody gets paid to waste money, to do nonsensical research. I mean, it makes sense they have some justification for it, and some of it might even be useful. But when you're doing a priori economics, as Mises said, or a guy like Walter Block, when Walter Block was doing his PhD at Columbia, for instance, he was not an Austrian at the time. He was not an a priorist. He was an a posteriorist. And his thesis advisor was Gary Becker, who became a Nobel Prize winner later on. And he was doing research on rent control. And the principle is that if you control the rent, you get worse rentals. And you get less rentals and not as good quality. And so he was doing this research, and he found that mostly that was true, but occasionally, sometimes he would find that, oh my God, I says, this is a real problem. He says, sometimes it isn't like that. Sometimes rental qualities and availabilities don't go down when there's rent control. And so he goes to Gary Becker, Walter Block does, and he says, hey, look what I've discovered. Maybe this isn't the law of economics. And Gary Becker, who was an a posteriorist, who believed that that's how economics was. See, economics with a line through it. He said, go back and do that research again. It can't be. In other words, the best economists, even Milton Friedman type economists, the best ones are a priorists. They know things are true, regardless of research. The research is there to illustrate, according to the Misesian economist, to the Austrian economist. It's not there to disprove or prove a theory. In other words, we know who we are. And we know, for instance, that individuals act purposely. We know that. We don't have to research to find out that people have ends in minds in life. And then they think of ways to get those ends, you know. I want that blue chair, so presumably if I walk this way, pick it up, I can pick it up and sit on it. That's the means that people come up with. Or they want to invent a new computer or a new flower arrangement or something. So it's a precondition of life. And that's why you don't, doesn't matter what kind of research you do, you know these are the truths. So that's about education, you see. And it's the same with law. As I was saying, in Somalia, in pre-Norman England, and in ancient Ireland for thousands of years, all the law was in a competitive state. There was no government in Ireland for thousands of years. No government. They had tuatha. Tuatha. Tuatha, yeah. Tuatha. Tuatha. And they were associations within Ireland, but they weren't geographic associations. You could disassociate from any tuatha and reassociate with another. And then they had a legal system called the Brehon system. And the Brehon system was independent of all the tuatha. There were between 80 and 120 of these tuatha in Ireland. And they had a king, but the king didn't make the law and he didn't enforce the law. He was the chief military officer and the religious leader. And when you had a dispute with somebody, you went and approached the surety, like the person who represented the other person. You know, he was his insurance, so to speak. And you said, I would suggest that we go to this particular Brehon, this particular legal expert. And if you agreed, then you were committed. And then the society knew that whatever the outcome was, if you didn't follow that agreement, you were in big trouble. Because instead of throwing you in prison or something, people just simply wouldn't do business with you. It's just like if you want to buy insurance or get a loan, you have to have a good record. Only this is everything. You know, it's a very strong way of getting people to comply. And so law is natural, it's local, it's competitive, it's based on self-interest, and I'm using the French word restitution, making the person whole again. That's the way traditional societies worked. But once the Normans invaded England, the Norman king says, no, I'm the victim here. And I get the fine, and we'll throw this guy in jail because I got buddies that want to be in the prison business. And that's what we have nowadays. That's why we have massive amounts of people in jail, because people in government are friends with people who want to be in the prison business. And of course they're all psychotic, you know, they're all into violence, control of the people. And so then the free market money and versus central banking money. Now, that's the most powerful thing, because everything we do in business requires money, right? You can't have a society of barter. It's impossible. Otherwise, there would be no complexity. Because you have to have, in order to have barter, you have to have two people coming together who each have the same thing that the other person wants. How often can that happen, right? In order to get things to move, you got to have something everybody wants, which is gold and silver, right? Because everybody knows everybody wants gold and silver. It developed over time. Become obvious that because everybody has it's a commodity that everybody wants. And the beautiful thing about it is it's valuable. You don't need much to be able to carry value around. It lasts, and it's divisible, and it's scarce. Those 5 qualities, that's what makes money.
Scarcity is the belief.
Yeah, well, that's the point. If you can manufacture gold and silver, you know, and then convince other people,
No, it's
But
already
this
there.
is-
We need to know how to tap into it. That's all.
well, mine it or manufacture it, you know. I mean, that's my point. It's scarcity is a belief. Everything is a belief. And, but
There's a class tonight that tells you how to tap into it. It's waiting on us.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. So, but the beautiful thing about freedom is that not only does it coordinate the purchase of goods, it coordinates the present with the future. And that's what interest rates do. For instance, if the society saves because people are producing, they don't need to eat everything that they made, right? They don't need to consume everything that was produced. So what they do is they save some of it. And that means, in other words, part of what they produced is still there. Instead of eating everything up that you produced, it's still there. And it's represented by money, and so your saving drives down interest rates because there's so much of it. The more you save, the more interest rates come down. The more the investor borrows, right? So they're coordinated. So it takes 5 years to produce something, supposedly, right? Some kind of implement, a car or whatever. And so that means people who saved are there to buy the thing that was produced by the investors that was caused by your savings. So it's a feedback loop. It's very complicated, and it's self-adjusting. And Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who, you know, he screwed up the world quite a lot with his general theory of economics. He's the one who said, no, it doesn't. There's no such relationship. People don't spend and they don't invest because they don't have enough animal spirits. He didn't say why all of a sudden they stopped having animal spirits. But Mises predicted in the 20s that there was going to be a crash in 29. Not in 29, he didn't say what year, because you can't tell. It's too complicated to tell. But you know there'll be a crash, because when the federal government creates, or the private Federal Reserve, doesn't make much difference, they're in bed together anyway. When they create money out of thin air, interest rates go down. But that's not based on savings. That's based on artificial money.
That's that manipulation.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Well, it's a way to steal from the people. It's a way to pay off your buddies in the government and not have to tax the people, which makes them mad, see? So they can just make the money out of thin air. And then it drives down interest rates, causes people to invest, but they're producing stuff that wasn't based on savings, so there's nobody to buy this stuff after a period of time. So that's why you have a bust after you have that boom created by that artificial interest rate, you see? That artificial expansion of the money supply causing a lower interest rate. So there's no coordination by the interest rate between...
Oh man, capture the fort. We gotta capture the fort.
There's no coordination between the savings rate and the investment rate.
Teach us how to
you see.
capture the fort.
That's what interest rates
Well,
are
money
for.
should money should be a measure of wealth, a medium of exchange. It should not be used as a power against each other. And that's what the whole system is. And I disagree with that system. I don't know what you're coming from, but money should not be used as a power to beat somebody else out of something. It should be a medium of exchange and a measure of wealth. And we're using that
Well,
money.
if you have a
We're
lawful
using money
society-
as a medium of power to manipulate the society,
If you-
manipulate everything we got.
But if you have a lawful society, that means you own yourself.
Well, but you mentioned the common law. The common law has basically been disowned. We don't even use it anymore. Common law is a thing of the past.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because
Because
centralized
we're not
power.
using it.
Because centralized power took it over. I mean, the Normans invaded England was brutal. They killed every Anglo-Saxon nobleman in England.
Well, sure, that's been age old. I mean, tribalism and all this stuff is since the world began.
Yeah.
It's still there.
Yeah. And
Just in
you know,
different
they
form.
came up with all these ideas about how the king had a divine right.
Yeah, we heard
And crime was against the king. It wasn't against the victim of crime. And so, see, prior to that, the people would collect, they would prosecute the crime on their own because they were going to get restored. They were going to get made whole again. That was the way it's done. That's the way it's done in Somalia. That's the way it was done in Old England, and that was the way it was done in Ireland. For instance, in Ireland, if you murdered somebody, they didn't execute you. No. Because that's not humane. That doesn't do anybody any good. You got 2 dead people instead of 1, right?
So what would they do?
They would have you work for the family as a servant. Isn't that beautiful?
For the
Because then they would be there and they would be able to share each other's humanity, even though you were in chains, because that's your punishment. But that's making the family whole because they get their laborer back, at least. The person might even become redeemed. He might become part of the family, That's the way it is, a natural way, And the thing about money and interest rates, it's a natural phenomenon because you don't want to spend all your money. And yet, if you can loan some to somebody, then he can do something with it. You got the capital, he's got the investment, the entrepreneurship, another French word, and then so the interest rate is a market phenomenon, and then in the end, if they're coordinated, then there's no boom, there's no bust. It continues to grow. The economy continues to grow, and then as it grows, people save more and more, and then it even grows more and more. There's no limit, and there's no bust. Now that's what Mises told the world, but Keynes took over the world. He took over the world of academic economics. So, and it's the same with, and so that's what happened to money. And it's the same with regulation of society, regulation of business. If you have competition, that is regulation, right? If you have law, that is regulation. You don't need to have a regulatory board because if you have a regulatory board, they tend to be defined by the people who are being regulated, as we all know. There are many examples, right? In the banking industry, in the military-industrial complex, they're all, or in the FDA with GMO. We know that who defines
Who becomes a regulator?
who becomes the regulators. The regulated become the regulators, see. But that's not the essential problem. The essential problem is the same problem I've described, is that it's too complicated to regulate. If you have law, you can, if somebody injures somebody else, it's simple, right? Now there is one problem that libertarians recognize, or economists recognize, and by the way, most economists who are a posteriorists, who believe in making economics like physics, experimental, most of them agree with most traditional microeconomic laws of economics. Economists don't believe in tariffs. They don't believe in minimum wage for the most part. There's a few that will talk it up. But if the money's there, you'll make up some nonsense, right? I saw a guy named Dubé on a news show telling about his research that shows that minimum wage doesn't increase unemployment. Now we're talking a priori again, right? Minimum wage doesn't increase unemployment. And he did all this elaborate research, and he went to counties that were right next to each other across state lines, so they had different minimum wage laws. One of them had an increase at a certain point in time, and they found out that it didn't really increase unemployment. And but I ask you, does it make any sense to say that? Logically, in an a priori way. Let's see, you're in business, all of a sudden you got to pay 10% or 20% more for a particular part of your input of your business. The helpers, right? And you're going to say, I'm just going to keep hiring as many helpers as I always do. I'm not going to replace them with a machine. I'm not going to replace them with, I'm not going to do the business in a different way so I don't need as many helpers. I'm just going to keep hiring as many. That's not what people do, right? If something becomes more expensive, they get less of it, right? you don't need to do research to find that out. And then they come up with this stuff, this Keynesian stuff, that if you pay the people more money, but you see, just shifting money around doesn't, or increasing money, making money out of thin air, or forcing it to go in a certain way, doesn't, it doesn't do anything, because what is an economy? An economy is all these different subjective beings who are trying to make themselves more happy, making decisions for themselves for which they only are competent. Whereas if you force people to behave a certain way, you're interfering with those decisions. So if you have somebody who's in a restaurant, he owns a restaurant, and you say, well, you got to pay him 20% more. You're just not going to hire as many people. Or it's the same if you wanted to get rid of racism or sexism. Well, look, if you made it illegal to fire somebody because you supposedly were racist or supposedly were sexist, there's two things you have to recognize. First is that if it's dangerous, if you can be sued because of that new law, you're not going to hire those people. You're creating racism and sexism, right? And two, it doesn't happen. Those things just don't happen in the real world, in the free market. They only happen with government, because government is a monopoly. It doesn't have to obey any market laws, right? And so there's going to always be more racism and sexism wherever there's no free market, which is where government is, or if the government imposes laws on the marketplace, which takes away free market, like the one I just mentioned. So what happens is if you're stupid and you don't hire somebody because he's black, but he happens to be skilled, and the guy down the street's not stupid, and he hires the guy, not only does he hire him, but he can get him for cheaper. Because your lack of demand drives his wages down. He has to travel another 10 miles to get to your business, so therefore you can hire him for less. And you're getting the good man, or woman, or whatever, and the other guy's not. That's going to drive the other guy out of business. He's getting, because the guy that's hiring all the skilled people, because he's hiring on the basis of their skill. He's not hiring on the basis of their color. Color doesn't help your business. You Your racism doesn't help your business. Sexism doesn't help your business. I'll tell you another thing. This whole thing about biology, about women getting less money, it's all nonsense. Women get less money because it's their biology not to work as much. And if you don't work as much, you can't get paid as much because you don't know as much. You don't have as much skill. And I'll just prove it to you. I'll prove it to you. Unmarried women, no, not unmarried women. Women who have never been married. There's a distinction. Unmarried women, women who have been married, have had this tendency not to stay at home. It's the nature of biology. You can't argue with this thing. Unmarried women make as much as unmarried men. Women who've never been married make as much as men who've never been married in the same exact profession. And that's a fact. There is no such thing as sexual discrimination. That's just politics. They do that in order to get more votes. That's where Hillary's votes are coming from. It doesn't matter if she's a murderous warmonger, right? Which she is, right?
Yeah.
She's just a big thug. She's just a big gangster. And it doesn't matter. Yeah, but she's going to get us women our rights. Well, you never had your rights taken away from you. And that's insane, you know. That's insane because it's a priori. Because understanding is a priori. The way the world works is inside us. We understand how the world works. Because the world is us. The operations, the physics of the world is us on a deeper level. But on the level, if you study physics and Maharishi Vedic science, you see that. But on the level of economics, the world is us. And I forget the point I was trying to make. Yeah, that's the reason that you have to appreciate a priori knowledge that Mises discovered 100 years ago, or that Carl Menger discovered in 1872 when he discovered the law of margin utility. If you want the additional, you don't want the additional item of a homogeneous good as much, according to your subjective valuation. That's the exact words that they used, and they use in Austrian economics. Subjective valuation. Just like, what's her name?
Vera.
Huh? Vera. Just like Vera was saying, you create your own gold. She's left me a note if I want to go to that. You create your own reality. And again, where was I?
Subjectivity, you create the value.
Yeah. That's right. You create value. The world is a creation. The human world is a creation. To some degree, the biological world is a creation. But again, it's on a deeper level. That's why I go to the dome, to operate on that deeper level, which governs all the levels. But that's what we create, even without recognition of that deepest level. We create on just Henry Ford, just to give a not a terribly spectacular example, or the guy that was in Apple that died, right? He was just creating a new world for us. It's not that spectacular because it's just a technological device, but still, just to illustrate the point, right? So regulation is here. There's no authority out there, and there's no competence out there, because the competence is only here, and economics in the marketplace is just interactivity of every one of us. That's all it is. It's just us people, us subjective beings.
Now you talk about regulation. I'd like to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Why is the government of the Federal Reserve regulating down the interest rate for those that invest, instead of regulating the interest rate that goes too high for those that want to invest and don't invest because of that? Why
Okay.
They're regulating the wrong side of it.
That's exactly it. When you create more money, because they've been
Out of nothing.
quantitative easing, right? When you do that, you're not creating wealth.
That's right.
You're not creating chairs and carpets and walls and automobiles.
Right.
But when you create those things, you are creating those things, right? And you do that with money.
That's
with
manipulating money,
with real money.
and
See?
it causes the cycles.
Yeah,
Which,
money which is created by which is represented by a commodity, gold and silver, right? And
well, it used to be, but it's not now.
not now, yeah.
No.
And it's created that way, and the interest rates are all structured by my desire. You know, what did our grandmothers used to say? Save for the future. See, but the Federal Reserve destroyed the desire to save because
Right.
your value of your money goes to hell. So what the rich do, what the people who really understand, like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki, is they borrow. That's how they do it. But none of us have that ability, right? Either because we don't have the credit or we don't have the skill to know how to borrow. And so they take advantage of that situation, see? But guys like Robert Kiyosaki, my criticism with him, my problem with him, is he's not like Peter Schiff, who says not to inflate, but to let everything be backed up in gold and silver, so it's real. He says, well, we have financial education so that people will learn how to handle this rotten system. But it's rotten because, as I said earlier, you grow organically. And society grows. There's no limits to how much you can grow, and there's no busts. In a free society, there's no busts. There's only boom. There's only growth. And after a while, people are so affluent that they just sit back and relax. Because that's one of the axioms of Austrian economics. Not only this a priori axiom here, all individuals act purposely. They seek means to achieve ends. And I forgot the book. It's a big, thick book. He used that axiom, plus the axiom that humans desire leisure, plus the fact that there are a variety of goods. Those three axioms, I think maybe four, all of economic branches were deduced from that, logically. It's not an experimental science, contrary to what they tell you. So the idea of capital is not the idea of expanding the money supply. You're not growing capital. You have to grow capital in order to make everybody wealthier, right? You got to accumulate iron and steel and, and machinery, and that's capital. That's not stuff people eat, right? You don't eat tractors. You just shove dirt around with them, right? Or lift things up and make them buildings.
You call that capital? Is that the right word for capital?
Yeah. There's goods. A good is anything that people desire. But some things they desire for their personal fulfillment. Other things they desire as a way of producing those goods that other people desire. And then it goes up in hierarchies. You got to produce this carpet. You need the contractor. And then the contractor to lay the carpet, right? And then you need, but to produce, then you need a truck, right? And then you need the truck that delivered it to the store, and then you need the factory that delivered it to the store, or put it in where it was put in the truck, and then you need all the ingredients, and then you need all the energy for all these steps, right? Electricity to whatever they do to put down the carpet if they don't do it all manually.
So what word are you using to represent that? Goods?
Everything other than the fact that the carpet is here, which is a consumer good, is a capital good.
Capital.
Yeah,
I
there are
thought capital
layers. It's layers of good.
No, I thought capital only meant money, cash. I didn't know investment. I didn't know that. I don't know.
Yeah, capital in a free society, but in fiat currency, when you're expanding, you're not creating capital. You're just creating currency, a fiat currency.
Different word.
Yeah, whereas gold and silver will always be connected to capital because it is capital. And so it's just an exchange of capital for capital, you know? And somebody said to me, it's impossible to have interest rates because if you loan out the money, there's not enough, based on gold and silver, there's not enough gold and silver to pay it back because they have to have interest rates. But what I realized about that, the fallacy behind that, is that only a fraction of what people have, the money in the society, is used in lending. Whereas the gold and silver that's dug out of the mines is larger than that. It's based on the whole of consumption, the whole of the money supply, the whole of the population, not just the population that's doing business. See? So it's a fraction. Therefore, therefore it's the amount that's needed to pay back compared to the amount that's dug out of the ground. So it's not a paradox that you can lend money based on gold and silver, and then there's not enough gold and silver to pay back with the interest. You know, that's not true.
Well, wait a minute, where do you get the gold for the interest? Where does that come from?
That's the question. The question is, if you're lending it out, how are they going to pay it back? Because they have to pay back the principal in gold and silver plus the interest. But if there's, you know, if they have to pay 5%, where do they get the gold and silver? Well, the answer is, it's only a fraction of the demand for gold and silver that causes people to dig it out of the ground that's used in those transactions, maybe 20%, see? So if they dig out, you know, so if they dig out so much percentage of those transactions to pay that interest, I mean, whatever they dig out is much more for a much bigger population than just the population that's doing business. See? So there's plenty of gold and silver to pay back that interest.
Well, you know, I don't know if I can say something, but
In any case, even if they ran out of gold and silver, which is, I don't know if that's very likely, the Earth's pretty big. Even if they ran out of it, the market would adjust. See? People would anticipate. That's the other thing about the market, about people, is they're thinking about the future and they're anticipating. That's what insurance is for. That's what you know, borrowing and lending is for. That's what savings are for. It's anticipating the future. It's called time preference. Time preference, if you want to consume it right now, you know, that's time preference. If you want to consume it later, then you're saving, and then you're providing a foundation for growth of a marketplace. Now, the most difficult is defense from foreigners. If you have a society without government, how can you defend from foreigners? Well, that's a fun question, and it's mostly difficult according to the intellectuals. And I'm probably a little bit loose on this. But there's a problem called it's called the free rider problem. You ever heard of that problem?
free what?
Free rider. If you have society that's anarchistic and there's no government, they can't collect taxes from everybody, and you want defense from foreign invaders, and you know, a certain percentage of people buy defense, the rest of them ride on it for free, because if they're defended within the territory from invasion, that means the other people who are in there who aren't paying into that defense system are getting it for free. And that's a burden, you know, on the cost of it. So therefore it wouldn't work. That's the theory, see. But the thing about government is that government is not, it's not there. I mean, there are, like I say, there are good people in government, they have good intentions. But in fact, there are bad people that get in there, or people the belief in government is the condition where there's bad people in society who would go in there and they would say, Jesus, I can get power over people. You ever hear of bad cops? You know? You ever hear of cheating politicians that like to steal? People in the stock market, in the on Wall Street, you know, or the people in Congress, or the military-industrial complex, or the educationalists. They're all into taking the money from the people because they figure they own us. That's what they figure. Just watch them on YouTube, on the cops on YouTube. They obey me or I'll shoot you. Bam! They do it all the time. And that's the whole mentality that goes to a monopoly power. Now let's say you had a perfect society. What would you do then? Then you wouldn't have people like that, right? You wouldn't have evil people taking over. But what would they do? And so let's say you wanted to defend from evil invaders. Now, of course, if you had a perfect society, you wouldn't have evil invaders. How would you do that and avoid the free rider problem, where some people wouldn't pay into whatever it would take to defend? Well, the answer is, one, there are multiple layers by which a country defends itself. And two, it's a cultural thing. To have a culture of defense, it's just something that grows, even though, but here's the third reason, here's the subtlest reason that David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, who is an anarchist, but an a posteriorist, he's a logical positivist, he points out in his book, The Machinery of Freedom, that radio broadcasting has a free rider problem. Nobody has to pay for it. You know, it's got there. So what they did was they invented advertising. Now something like that is going to happen in defense. You'll invent some kind of way of getting everybody to pay for it, even though they didn't voluntarily pay for it. They have to listen to those stupid commercials.
Was Milton Friedman, did he follow Mises, or is he?
No, he was the major. He and Keynes were the major opponents of Mises.
Oh, he was.
Yeah, because Milton Friedman was like 40% or 60% or libertarian, but he wanted the central banking to work. He figured he could make it work. He figured that there were laws of nature, and his whole thing is he had graduate students doing research on what caused inflation all over the world, different countries, money supply, and prices going up. Money supply going up, prices going up. That was his whole thing. But it was experimental. It was data crunching, see? And
who was the famous? Was anybody famous against Keynesian? Who was the opposite of him? Was there somebody?
Well, Friedman was kind of the opposite. See the difference between the Chicago School, which is Milton Friedman, and the
Milton Friedman from the Chicago School.
Yeah, the school is Chicago School of Economics is Milton Friedman. It's the same thing. The difference between him and the Keynes is during what they say. Milton Friedman says is that when there's a recession, you should create more inflation. Just make money cheaper. See, because he was a fiatist. His son said he wasn't a fiatist, and that he was just acting according to this fiat system. He was just describing. But he said you should create more inflation, but you shouldn't. We should shrink the government, which is what the Austrians say. Although they don't say the first part, right? The first part is you let everything collapse, which is what Ron Paul is saying right now. He said you let everything collapse, right? Because if you don't let it collapse now, when it'll collapse later, whether you want it to or not. And it's going to be really bad.
It's going to happen.
He was on that Stansberry report.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, he's doing a big commercial for him. Because
Rand Paul just stood up to in the Senate. He stopped that Patriot Act.
he stopped it?
He stopped it. Yes. I mean, at least until they try to figure some other way to get it out.
Yeah.
They stopped it for now.
Yeah. He's the guy that's a good percentage
It's
libertarian.
unbelievable.
According to Judge Napolitano, he's actually 100% libertarian. But he's a closet 100%.
He's closet.
Yeah.
He is.
So so Friedman he said the Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve not expanding. But that's not true. They lowered interest rates immediately. to try to get the stock market to pick back up. So I don't know. I don't know enough details about to say why he said that. And but the Keynesians not only wanted to expand the money supply again to lower interest rates to stimulate during the Depression. They want to spend more, you see, because they think that spending is what causes growth. But that's insane, because what causes growth is the choice between savings and consumption. If you decide to save more, and consume less, right, down on this curve, because you can only do two things with your money. You can either invest it, or save it, or spend it, right? So what causes more growth is the amount of savings that you have. And if you want to increase the amount of savings, you come down towards the savings side, you're going to cause more growth. I'm talking about society as a whole, right? So that's called the production possibilities frontier. And so, what the Keynesians say is to spend more. But if you spend more, you're taking away from investing, from savings. Whether you do it through taxes or you do it on your own. And not only that, that's not capital. The idea is if you pump money into it, you're going to cause things to grow. But that's not going to create more capital to make. You're not going to have more machinery if you pump more money into a system. You may draw capital from somewhere else because that's where the money is. But net, there's no gain, there's loss. And the reason it's not just gross loss, it's not just even shift, is because value is subjective, as Carl Menger said in 1872.
Well, wouldn't it be, if you create, it depends, just creating money, but it depends where the money goes when you create it. Like now it goes to the stock, to the banks, and to the, it doesn't go into the society. It's not going into the system, into the society where people would spend it.
Yeah, but
And
you
if
see,
but if they did
but
that,
you see,
they'd spend it.
government shouldn't decide where anything goes, because they don't know.
Oh,
And even if they knew, they don't know, because nobody knows, because everything is subjective, which is the basis of this whole talk. Objectivity is nothing but subjectivity. And so, for instance, this whole thing that all the politicians say about infrastructure ought not to be public. It ought not to be built by, the roads and bridges should be private. If the roads and bridges were private, not only private in the fascist sense, but I mean private in the free market sense, right? Now, there is an advantage to having private roads that are hired by governments. But those tend to be diluted by the fact that there's politics involved, right? But if roads were private, just like education, defense, anything, the experimentation, the feedback, that's one thing I haven't talked about enough. You're talking about feedback. If you're in business, there's constant feedback from all sides, from your employee side, from your supplier side, from your customer side, from your financing side, sources side, you know. All this feedback. You got to make all those people happy. If you're in business, you're a great man. You're making all these people happy. And I'll tell you something. You know, when you watch Hollywood, you watch TV shows, businessmen are crooks. But it doesn't make any sense. Because in business, you're not the government. Somebody said, some guy on campus, he said, Rockefeller, the way he got his refineries is with guns. Now that's psychotic to say something like that, right? Because Rockefeller was a powerful politician, right? He was a powerful figure, billionaire, very powerful figure. But he wasn't a third world dictator that could just take whatever he wanted, right? There was other forces. There was actual law going on. The reason the country grew so much after the Civil War is because it was a lawful country, more or less, right? More or less. Or this idea about Lincoln. Lincoln was there. He was shot because he opposed the bankers. That's bullshit. He signed the Banking Act of 1863, which is the precursor to the Federal Reserve. It created a three-tiered banking system. Lincoln was on the side of the bankers.
I thought he was, yeah.
Yeah,
Who shot him then? Who-
I don't know. So why wouldn't you shoot a brute like that? See, and we made a hero out of that guy, and he was the American Hitler. 800,000 people. They've upgraded they re-estimated the numbers.
600 I heard before. So
That's what it used to be.
Yeah.
They upgraded it to 850. 800,000 people, 50,000 civilians, raping all those people and
Oh, yeah, I know.
burning everything.
He's a mass murderer.
He was, yeah, and the Corbin Amendment. The Corbin Amendment. Now we're talking about education here, right? Right there. They want us, the government wants education. They want us to think government is for them. I mean, that we're there for us. Lincoln wrote the Corbin Amendment. If he didn't write it, he was with the people that wrote it. He probably wrote it because he was, he was quite an author. He wrote letters to governors telling them and joining them to get their state legislatures to pass the Corbin Amendment. The Corbin Amendment is you can look it up on the internet,
What is
and
it?
it passed the House and the Senate. The Corbin Amendment enshrines in the Constitution, would have enshrined, but it didn't get elected because of the Civil War, so-called Civil War. It enshrines that the federal government will never interfere with slavery.
This was the Corman Amendment?
The Corbin Amendment. Lincoln wrote this, most likely.
So they never interfered with slavery?
Huh?
Okay, go on. I didn't know.
Yeah. And the moral tariff, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, is what was passed. In the South, it was passed because, just like in 1829 with the Tariff of Abomination, the northern states wanted the southern states that didn't have factories to have to pay a high tariff so that they wouldn't be buying their stuff from Europe, they would be buying it from northern manufacturers. And Lincoln was in on that. That was what he was. Lincoln was not riding around Illinois on a mule with his feet dragging on the ground. He was riding around in the back of a railroad car. He was a wealthy lawyer. He's got the biggest house in Springfield on that block. You go over to his house in Springfield, it's the biggest house in town, on that block, from those days. He was a wealthy, he did a deal with McClellan, his first general. They're all in bed together, right? He did a deal before he was president. There was a city that was suing, the railroad was suing a city for trying to tax the railroad, right? And so Lincoln was defending the railroad. So he shows up to defend the railroad against the city's taxation, and the other side doesn't show up. So and Lincoln gets $5,000, which in those days was a huge amount of money, right? And guess who gave him the $5,000? General B. McClellan, his future general. George McClellan, his name was. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, there's a place called Lincoln's Land. Lincoln's riding around on the back of these railroad cars. The railroads in those days only went to Omaha. They didn't go west because he was the one that instigated the fascism that created the railroads across the country, that murdered all the Native Americans, right? Because they used these brutal soldiers to do it, right? I mean, that General Sherman was a total. He was like Goering, he'd kill anybody, any Native American, Those guys would kill. They just murderous thugs. That's all they were. And anyway, he bought some land in Cedar Falls. And that's where the railroad head went in. And he signed the bill in *62
Where the railroad did
when he
what
was
there?
president.
What did the railroad do there? You said?
Yeah, they started in Cedar Falls. There was some big railroad head there that created the Central Pacific.
Oh,
Or
going
the
west.
Union
They
Pacific.
started going west from there?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not that I'm focusing on corruption. I'm focusing on where the intelligence is. The intelligence is here. It's not out there, right? He doesn't know what's better for here, right? We're talking about individualism and localism, right? And voluntarism. Those three isms And that's not ideology, that's just nature. That's just the way life is done. It's the way it's done in Somalia right now. And of course, all the media says, oh, well, you know, they got this provisional government, and they got these governments in the north that they're not really governments, they're just tribal shufflings, you know. And the people are just, and in Somalia, you do have to pay some people. You have to pay some strong men over there. You know what it amounts to? About 10% of your income. They got airlines over there. And I read an article in the Atlantic online. And then first of all, he was lamenting the fact that the communist airline that was there is defunct, right? Well, that's what you want, right? You don't want some glorious thing that is based on the savaging of the people in order to have some glorious thing for the elite leaders of the strongman leaders of the place, right? And call that something to lament the lapse of, right? There's 9 airlines in Somalia. Rickety goddamn airlines, but these guys are getting in them planes and getting people around and making a couple of bucks, see? Fucking seats fall back on you like this. You gotta hold the seat up. They pack the people in there. There's not enough seats, you know, and people have to stand. But you can't regulate prosperity, right? You can't go to Bangladesh and say, well, you know, your minimum wage should be so much. People would starve. You know, if you're not worth anything, if you're a kid, you don't deserve the minimum wage, right? You don't know anything. You start out sweeping, you know, for what the minimum wage is half, you know, and then you put stuff on the shelves, and then you learn how to take inventory. Before you know it, you're worth something. The minimum wage isn't relevant anymore, but you got to start out there. You got a ladder, you know, and what the minimum wage does is it takes out the first few rungs of the ladder. You can't get going. You got to have the first few rungs. You don't say, well, you got to have a living wage. Well, no, you don't have to have a living wage. You can live at home. You can share a place, you know. You can get your, I mean, why is it that they're in such dire straits in the first place? It's because you had all these problems, all these interventions in the first place, right? Because 100 years ago, like Peter Schiff, the guy that predicted the crash of '08, not the time, but that it would come, just like Ron Paul. He was Ron Paul's economics advisor on the '08 presidential campaign. He says his granddad, was a carpenter. You know, he's a Jewish carpenter. And he raised 6, 7 kids, 4, 5, 6 kids, I don't know. His mother didn't have to work. His grandmother didn't have to work. There's money in those days. Money was worth something. But the Federal Reserve was just getting started, see? They were just getting started, and they were screwing people, but they didn't screw the country into where it is now. Because, for one thing, we were on the gold standard, see? But they did everything they can to get around that. You know? But defense is possible, because it's possible to have defense because, you know, if you want to go as a businessman where there's no taxes and no regulation, you know, to start a factory, you're going to go to an insurance company and say, I need insurance from invaders, foreign invaders, right? And but the insurance company has to have many factories to do that, companies to do that in order to afford to insure those companies, right? And then you got the free rider problem, but still, the insurance companies may say to the people who don't get the defense insurance, your bill's going up, you know? Because otherwise our whole operation goes down the tubes, and we lose. Something like that would happen. And plus everybody's armed. You know why the Japanese didn't invade America during World War II? Because they knew everybody was armed. And that's what the admiral said. One of the admirals, he said, every blade of grass would be a gun behind it. We're not going to invade that country. You can't. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Vietnam. These rinky-dink, backwoods native peoples held off the biggest armies in the world. Same as the Revolutionary War. We held off the most powerful army in the world. We defeated them. And Washington, by the way, was a son of a bitch. He was a pure son of a bitch.
Washington was?
He was a nutcase, psychotic son of a bitch.
Really?
Worst general you ever saw.
I thought he was good.
Worst general you ever saw. And it was just pure logistics that we won the war. Because they had to run, the British had to run around and stuff. I mean, he was screwing everything up. He couldn't fight a battle to save his life. He was a murderous thug. I just saw a big report on him. So everything we're getting is nonsense, But the main thing is the epistemological problem. People aren't thinking for themselves from right here, They're not being themselves. They don't have a self. That's the whole problem with life. You got to have a self.
I just want to go back to Lincoln for a second. I think, he created the greenbacks, and that went against the Federal Reserve. It went against the banks. It wasn't the Federal Reserve. The banks didn't like that greenback stuff.
Well,
And I think maybe that's why they did it.
there was a guy named Jay Cook. Lincoln
saying
did
he was with him.
greenbacks,
I mean, he
but
was
mostly the war was funded by bonds. They were selling bonds. There was a guy named Jay Cook, and he helped. Him and his brother got some senator elected. And Jay Cook was famous for making a lot of money selling bonds for the war. I mean, there was plenty of fascism going on. There was plenty of, whenever you have a war, it's a fascist war, right? Because some manufacturer is making a lot of money on armaments, right? Or, I don't know how the bankers, see, first of all, Jackson killed the banks. He killed the National Bank. And there was just state banks. After he was done, there was just state banks for 20 years. Private banks.
Well, not all about the Civil War,
And-
though. They grew back again. They got stronger again.
Well, in 1863, the Banking Act created national banks. It created central banks in New York City,
In 1860.
central city banks. Then they created city banks on the lower upper tier, the next upper tier, and then they created country banks. But it was all, you had to have so much capital to get started, and you could create one of these banks. And you could keep your reserves in this bank, or you could keep them in your own bank, and then or down to the lower bank. They had to have some reserves, so it wasn't completely fiat.
Oh, good.
They had to have, they could use greenbacks in the beginning, or cash, I guess, traditional cash,
What did they do
and then
between-
gold and silver.
What did they do between Jackson and 63 then? What was happening then?
60 to 60,
To 60?
because 61 is when the greenback started, I
I
think.
wonder what they did. The banks, there must be some kind of banking going on.
Yeah, so
When
the
they did
banks
away-
were simply not powerful. The bankers were not powerful after Jackson stopped them.
Right. So
See?
they really
And there was only one
vice
recession. There was a recession in 57, but it was pretty small. But you see, the states, the banks always try to inflate, right? If you write a note, you try to sell as many notes as you can, right? But if you're on a gold standard, they have to pay you back in gold, right? Well, what happened was the states would harass, there's people would buy these notes up at a remote distance and take them back to the bank to collect the gold and silver, right? That was their business, right? And they'd buy them at a discount, so they'd make a little profit, right? But what the press did and what the governments did is they vilified these people for returning these notes back to the banks, so that the banks could, because what do governments want? They want cheap money. They can't just keep stealing the money from taxes, because that's politically very difficult, right? So that's what the is this thing still working? Yeah. So that's what happened. The state banks were screwing it up. I mean, the state governments were screwing it up because they wanted cheap money. So they wanted to vilify anybody who wanted to get all their gold and silver. See? But there was a bank in Boston, and they were the bank that kept all the country, the distant banks, in order. They made them pay off, and they made money doing it. They would redeem those notes issued by those different banks, and the whole thing was kept in order, you know.
So there was no national bank from the time of Jackson all the way up to the Federal Reserve? There was no national banks? I guess there wasn't.
No, he killed it. He killed it in 36 or
Yeah, I
something.
know that, but
And I think in 37 there was a pretty big recession, but that was based on the inflations
I
from.
just wonder what happened between there and the Federal Reserve. I often wondered what happened. Because they say.
Yeah, well then Lincoln in 63, you see, the bankers got their way because they created this huge Banking Act of 63. And it was the precursor to the Federal Reserve. It was an inflationary system.
Well, I didn't know they had a.
But in 79, we went back on the gold standard. And you can't inflate very much when you're on the gold standard.
1879.
Yeah. In the 70s, there was quite a lot of deflation. And from the war, from the 60s, war in the 60s. So there was a lot of shrinkage, but there was a lot of manufacturing going on at the same time. There was a lot of capital going on. So there was actually quite a lot of growth in the 70s, growth. See, the 60s was the decade of the war, and therefore the productions of everything else went down the tubes. You know, that was a tough time for the country. You know, Lincoln, he was psychotic. You know, because he said that the Union came before the states. Because there was some unification that took place in 1873, that was his logic, you know. They were just some getting together to, you know, deal with the Brits, you know. But the states were independent. The King George, when he signed the peace treaty, signed it 13 times. You know, it was with 13 different colonies, different states. They were independent states.
Well, I guess I've been saying for a long time, the three presidents that got assassinated were done in by the banking industry. And I was always saying Lincoln, Garfield, and Kennedy. I was saying that for years now. You're saying something that maybe Lincoln wasn't assassinated by the, let's say, I know Kennedy was for sure, but I don't know.
Well, how do you explain the Banking Act of 63?
I don't know.
That's an inflationary banking system that was created.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. I never heard of it. I didn't even know.
Yeah, well, that's what they never heard, because
It's the first I remember.
because if your object referral, if you're looking for villains in your object referral, you're going to well, I forgot what I was going to say about that. I was thinking about that the other day, about the Banking Act of 63. So let me, I mean, about populist theories, you know. If you don't understand the history of economics, of the history of economics, you can't make logical conclusions, you know. He was right there with them. He was, if you're in with the big railroads, he was a big railroad man.
I know he was with them. He was with them.
There was a lot of manufacturers in Pennsylvania, maybe, I don't think there was too many in Ohio at that time. I'm sure he was in with them. Now, there were no corporations in those days except the railroads.
No, he was in with the North, and that's why they attacked the South.
Yeah, he
I
figured.
I just thought that's
See, this is what people think when they're object referral. You know, they think they can fix things with power, with monopoly power. They think they can fix things. Oh, we'll go into Iraq. We'll get rid of the bad